Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Kaufman. I'm the product manager of SmartStream RDU. Unfortunately, Rocky Martinez could not join us today, the CTO of the RDU, so you are stuck with me for your welcoming statements. I just wanted to thank everyone for dialing in. We've had a couple workshops over the last year, and we have found them very helpful both to provide information out to the market and also to receive information in. This has been a collaboration and an industry effort overall. So again, I thank you everyone for joining us. I'll just say a few words before we dive into the rest of the agenda. I just want to highlight the fact that, as I just mentioned, this was a collaboration, and I think it's paying off. We started out with a number of the APAs and the RDU coming together to provide a solution to something that was really missing in the industry in order to help everyone become compliant with MiFID II. So, excuse the background noise. I think that we've all seen how the collaboration has worked to our benefit, and hoping that we continue with the success. So moving on to the operational update, we just wanted to give a quick update on how things are going. I just said it was a success, so why am I saying that? Right now we are up to about 104 SIs contributing to the SI Registry through 7 APAs. That's a large this is up from 48 SI contributors last February. So we really feel like we have, a full or mostly complete set of data in the SI registry with respect to how many SIs are actually contributing. From a product perspective, just to give you a little perspective of how many products we're supporting. So in the ISIN file, there's 1.8 million records. In the issuer file, 3,700 records, and in the COFIA file, 2,000 records. I suspect that over the next year, as the SI regime, which we'll talk about in a little bit, derivative SI regime comes into play, you'll see that number of 2,000 records in the COFIA file will increase. But that's a lot of information that is now being, sent, aggregated, and disseminated through the market. So that's wonderful news as well. A couple things to point out just that we wanted to make everybody aware of so that we continue to have clean data in the SI registry. So what are the typical reasons for rejected records when we're processing and doing the aggregation? What are the things that cause records to get rejected? It mainly falls into these 3 categories. We see delete records coming at times without an add record. So obviously that doesn't make sense. If we don't have it first and with an add record, then how can we delete a record? We see incorrect date formats coming along and invalid country codes. So this is just a quick reminder to pay attention to those things so that we can have straight-through processing and don't need to reject the files. The other thing that has come up is, should there be unique LEI per MIC? Yes, there should be a unique relationship between the two. We're seeing cases, though, where one LEI is shared by several MICs. So our understanding, and we can, of course, talk about this in the Q&A, but our understanding is that that should not be the case. And then Brexit support. Who knows if while I was commuting into the office, something has changed, since this is such a fluid situation. But we thought that it would be important to go over some of the changes that we are implementing. So we had to be a little bit forward-thinking in order to prepare for any of the scenarios, which all of us have been doing, whether you're a data provider or a firm. I think that everyone decided, months back that we needed to address Brexit by preparing for the various scenarios. In the SI registry area, the way that it was agreed upon to do this is by adding 2 columns to the template, one named UK submission and one named EU 27 submission. the fields have been added to all three of the templates, the ISIN, issuer, and COFIA files. We did this so that there could be some flexibility to use the template in under both regulations. How should SIs populate these new fields? In the case of a hard Brexit, SI should provide one row per record specifying in the row a yes or no for each new field. In the case of a soft or no Brexit, SI should provide a yes in both new fields. And let me just clarify this. So the SIs, so if there is no, say on March 29th, there is no Brexit or Brexit is delayed, then it really is not relevant, the two new fields. And so we are asking that SIs provide a yes in both fields. That just would mean that things are status quo, that things have not changed. You're still an SI for whatever instrument you've provided or COFIA or issuer record you've provided. And since the UK and the EU regulations would still fall under MiFID II, it's applicable to both, so it's just a default of yes in both. In the case of a hard Brexit or when a soft Brexit gets implemented, there should be one row per record, meaning if you are an SI for a given ISIN in the UK, then you would put a row, have a row in the ISIN file with UK submission as yes, and then whatever other relative information regarding mandatory, not mandatory, etc. You would also have, if you were, for that same ISIN, if you were applicable in the UK as well, then you would have another row with a yes in the UK. So you can indicate whether you are optional or mandatory per regulation. So if the UK and the EU end up having separate regulations post a Brexit, then you would have two rows if you were applicable to two. If you post-Brexit, if you're only an SI in one of the markets, then you would only, under one of the regulations, you would only have one row. So I hope that's clear. We had a lot of back and forth with various SIs after the last workshop last week, and so I want to make sure that I'm clear here, and again, we'll open up the lines and you can unmute yourselves in the Q&A, and we can go over this a little bit further. Lastly, is it mandatory to populate the new fields? Yes, initially validation is not performed on the new fields. SIs are encouraged to populate with a yes and yes. There was some concern from the SI community that everyone would not be prepared to populate the fields, and we could have a couple weeks of the data not being populated, and they did not want the current SI registry to be disrupted. Meaning they didn't want a bunch of rejected files coming through because perhaps they forgot to populate a yes. So for instance, if there is a no Brexit, right away there isn't a Brexit on a hard Brexit on March 29th, there was some concern that everyone wasn't going to get the yes and yes in right away. And so the rejects are not going to happen right away. However, we will be implementing validation rules. So it's kind of a cushion period transition period where you have a bit of time, but we will be implementing validation rules, so you need to get those, SIs need to get those yeses in there for a no Brexit or a soft delayed Brexit, and then otherwise you need to get the yes or the no in there. And we will start doing validations, but not initially. The SI regime derivative delay, moving on. So we just spend 2 seconds on this because we've talked about this so much in the last workshop. So we did add for the derivative COFIA file. As everyone knows, if you've been on our previous workshops or dealing with our templates right now, you know that in September, 7 new fields were added to the COFIA file to capture the additional segmentation criteria needed to support the SI regime for derivatives. In December, we began supporting the population of these fields. So that the fields were actually added to the template in September, and then in December, we gave a few months for everyone to get used to those fields and figure out how to populate them, and then in December, we began supporting the actual population of those fields, so SIs were able to start sending those fields. When this was in preparation for the March SI regime to kick in. However, as everybody knows, this has been delayed until 2020. We've gotten a few questions. Can I still populate the criteria fields even though the SI regime has been delayed? Yes, of course. There are, SIs out there that don't want to opt in at the highest level, which is the asset class, asset subclass. They'd rather opt in using some or all of the segmentation criteria. So please feel free to send those fields. We will be aggregating that data and sending that data out. And I know that those companies that have APIs or other things running that determine SIs at an ISIN level will be using that segmentation criteria. I know the RDU does in their MiFID product. So in our MiFID product, when we determine if a firm is an SI for a given instrument, we will be looking at all the segmentation criteria, and I know that we are not the only vendor that's doing that. So feel free to send in that data if it's applicable at the segmentation criteria level. And then the last one is change of APA. This has come up over the last couple of months, and so we thought it would be worth mentioning. What should I do if I change APAs? We've had some SIs that have changed APAs, whether it be for all their instruments or just a subset. So please, if you do change an APA, first send a delete record to your previous APA. Then send an add record with your new APA. We've been rejecting duplicates due to the fact that SIs are not sending in a delete record to their original APA. So we try, we have some validations that we run, and if we see the same record twice, then we start to delete them, and it ends up that it's just that the old APA record was not deleted. So please remember to send your delete records in first, and then send in the new record under the new APA. Okay, so I just did a lot of talking, and I'm sure there are questions. Last workshop we had a little bit of an issue with people coming off of mute, so I'm hoping that this time we don't run into the same issue. As Miriam had explained, to come off mute, please press #1, and we should be able to hear you. So I will open it up to questions. I'm hoping that nobody has questions and that we're still not having any issues with the mute. Oh.
Just to confirm from my side, no question.
Okay. Okay. So it looks like it's working, that you can come off of mute with #1. So if there are no questions, then we will close down the call. Please feel free to email the RDU with any questions if you do have follow-up questions after the call that you didn't think of now to ask, but as you're preparing to send in the new data. We've been doing testing, by the way, just as a side note, we've been doing testing with the APAs, and we will be going live.
Hello.
With, yes, hello. Do you have a question? Hello? Okay. So we are doing testing, and we do plan to still stick to our original schedule. So, are there any questions on the line before I disconnect?
Hello?
Hello? Do you have a question?
You hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. This is on the testing. So we received some emails from RDU on to provide some test data, and I'm not sure what exactly are we trying to test here. Are we testing the trades that this processed, or are we testing the files which were submitted to you with the two new columns?
Who is your APA?
Deutsche Börse.
Yeah, so with Deutsche Börse, the RDU plays two roles. We aggregate the data, but we also collect directly from the SIs. So in your case, it's just the testing for the Deutsche Börse SIs. It's the testing of sending the files to us with the additional two rows. So populate the two rows the way that you feel you need to populate them, and then send across the test files. That way we can make sure that the test files that you're sending are correctly populated and in the right formats, and that we can aggregate it to in correctly.
So we sent out a file last week. So when you started the testing and the initial, not the non-mandatory testing, the one which started last or 2 weeks back, and do we need to send that files again?
I think we had asked everyone for 5 days of filing. I don't know, Bhuvan, are you on the call? Hold on one second. Let me just make sure my operations.
Hi, Linda. Able to hear me?
Hey, yes, we are able to hear you. So what are we expecting from the SIs, Deutsche Börse's SIs to send to us? Is it 5 days of file?
Yeah, that's it, Linda. We are expecting the SIs or the APs to contribute 5 days of consecutive data. Right. So we had initially circulated the quality assurance guidance to all the SI registry partners, where we had agreed that each of the SIs of the APs need to contribute 5 positive as well as 5 negative test cases, and also they need to send the files for 5 consecutive days.
Okay, so that's your answer. So we would appreciate the 5 days.
So we have already sent the file to RDU directly. So does that mean then the APAs again need to send you? Because
No. So let me just clarify that. I'm sorry. So the RDU's relationship with Deutsche Börse is a bit different in that we collect data directly from the SIs, from their SIs, and we aggregate it together. For the other APAs, we receive a file directly from them. So when Bhuvan mentioned from the APAs and the SIs, it means from the APAs and the Deutsche Börse SIs. So you don't have to, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, so Deutsche Börse SIs, please send us 5 days worth of test files, the same way that you usually send us your files daily. And then for all other APAs, they have been sending us test files as well.
Okay, so we send you files. How do we know that whether it's correct or not? Just based on the response that we get the next day, that the files are the data we get back and the response from the operations?
Yeah, exactly right. We do send an email with our testing status. If you find any issues with the file, right, we'll send back what exactly the validations we did and if any of the records are rejected. Yeah. So if the file format is good, then we process the file and we also send an acknowledgement to you.
All right. Okay. But that's only for the testing, right? We don't have, going forward in production, we don't have to send files, because if you have sent it once, that should be sufficient enough, right?
However often you usually send it. Yeah, I don't know how often you usually submit your SI files.
Yeah, we use a CoFIA file, so there's not much change.
Yeah. So going forward, correct. Going forward, send it as you typically would. But for testing purposes, we're just making sure that for quality assurance purposes that we get 5 files.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hello?
At least hello.
Hi, yes. It's my understanding that the new file format is going live this weekend on the 16th. So is it a fair expectation or accurate expectation that between now and the Brexit go live, whenever that should happen, any of the existing EU records would be coming in with a Y value?
So if there is no hard Brexit or soft Brexit as of March 29th, so if there is no separation of the regulation, then we expect just one row with a yes and a yes. So the EU and the UK columns would be yes, and you'd only have to send one record if there's no Brexit. If there is a Brexit, then we would expect you to send the EU record separate and the UK record separate, and then, you know, if it applies to both, right? Because some firms will only be sending one, depending. So, so it's a yes, yes if nothing changes. If the world continues to operate as it is today with MiFID II and everyone under one regulation, it's a yes, yes in both columns. If something does change, then it's per your firm's you know, trading activities, whether you need to send one or two records with the yes or the no appropriately populated.
Okay, just a follow-up. My interest is not about the provision of data to RDU. It's about the consumption of the data from the RDU.
Okay.
Because, no, from our firm, we will be populating the flags. My concern is the other firms may not be, and this file goes live over the weekend, so we're definitely expecting the Y for the EU records until Brexit happens.
Yep, but when you say EU records, that's why, so both, there will only be one record, right, if before Brexit happens with a yes and a yes, unless you're preparing for, in the live version, right, and so it should be a yes and one record until we know, until something happens.
Right, the concern is that the flag might not be populated at all. Right, and if that's the case, when does this validation that you mentioned kick in?
Yeah, so I don't know if we have a planned date. I think we were looking to see how the data was coming in because we didn't want to reject half of the fields, right? So we were going to analyze the data over a couple weeks to see how SIs were doing managing the change, and then if it looks like everybody's doing things appropriately, and we wouldn't be rejecting the majority of the SI registry and causing chaos, then we would start to put in those validations. So on our side, the validations are pretty much ready to go. It's just us taking a look at the data to make sure that we don't disrupt the market by putting them in. Does that make sense? So I don't have a particular date for you. It's going to be, so we will keep everybody informed on the date, but as of now, we're going to try to look at the data first.
Okay, it's just there could be a disruption prior to Brexit if the community is not leveraging these flags and the consuming applications are dependent on it. We might start seeing loss of data on things that otherwise would be tagged for EU between these next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point to point out to everybody on the call, right? The SIs need to be, so I get it, right? We're walking a thin line between the disruption. So we are assuming, so we're also a consumer, right? So we kind of play on both sides of the game. So we're aggregating and sending out, but we're also consuming into the RDU's other products. And right now, we have built it so that I know for our interpretation of the SI registry, prior to Brexit, we are assuming that the one row is a yes and a yes, right? So we've kind of built that in for now so that we can, so whether there's a yes there or not, if there's a row, then we have assumed that it's a yes and a yes. So I think these two rows, these two columns prior to Brexit, right, so we've also talked about defaulting them, right, but we're not the owners of this data, the SIs are, so we didn't want to put in a default. So I'm hearing your concern. I would just suggest that anybody consuming this data and trying to automate it in any fashion before any kind of decision is made before the 29th should assume or put something into place where they manage this data as a yes and yes, which is what we've done. Yeah. There was no perfect solution, I guess, is the answer. Any other questions? It's good to know that the pound one worked this time. Okay. If no other questions, then we will close the call. But again, as I started to say before, we are open to calls or emails to answer any of your questions. So please feel free to reach out to me directly or to any of the contacts that you have. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.